Warm greetings and good evening from the Chennai Center for China Studies. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to today's Chennai Center for China Studies book discussion with Professor Kerry Gershaneck on his book, Political Warfare, Strategies for Combating China's Plan to Win Without Fighting. To introduce the term political warfare to our viewers today, political warfare is the use of all forms of pressure, political, economic, diplomatic, cultural, intelligence, military, and paramilitary that one country exerts on another to do what it wants to do short of actual fighting or combat. The success of the People's Republic of China's political warfare can be seen in its ability to block criticism in the United Nations of its human rights abuses, its wolf warrior diplomacy, its expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, its ability to keep Taiwan out of international organizations, including the World Health Organization, and its cover-up of the origins of the Wuhan virus, also known as the CCP virus, all the while promoting to the world of its own miraculous success in containing the virus and quickly rebuilding its economy. All these are because China has both the financial resources and the manpower to engage in political warfare on a global scale. The series of webinars with experts by the Chennai Center for China Studies will take a closer look at how this political warfare by China has evolved in terms of its ability to mobilize people, resources, and technologies on the current scale. For combining these pieces of the puzzle provides a comprehensive picture of this political organization called the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. To present this topic today, we have three distinguished guests here with us today, connecting across time zones. The author of the book, Professor Kerry Gershaneck. Professor Kerry has been a visiting scholar at the Graduate Institute of East Asian Studies, National Chengchi University for the past 3 years. He is an adjunct professor with University of Canberra's Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis in Australia. He was the distinguished visiting professor at Royal Military Academy and the Royal Thai Naval Academy for a total of 8 years. Previously, Professor Kerry was a strategic planner and spokesman for the Office of the Secretary of Defense and a senior fellow and director of governmental and public relations for Pacific Forum CSIS, a regional security think tank. A former US Marine Corps officer, he has extensive intelligence, counterintelligence, special warfare, combat arms, and strategic communications experience. His writings have been featured in academic journals and news media publication in Taiwan, the US, Japan, Thailand, Hong Kong, and Europe. Thank you, Professor, for being with us here today. Our next distinguished speaker who will deliver the special address for today is Lieutenant General Wallace Gregson. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Previously, he served as Chief Operating Officer for the United States Olympic Committee, then as an independent consultant before entering government in 2009. From 2003 to 2005, he was Commanding General of the Marine Corps Forces Pacific and Marine Corps Forces Central Command, where he led and managed over 70,000 Marines and sailors in the Middle East, Afghanistan, East Africa, Asia, and the United States. From 2001 to 2003, he served as Commanding General of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Japan, where he was awarded the Japanese Order of the Rising Sun, the Gold and Silver Star, the Korean Order of National Security Merit, which is the Gukseon Medal, and the Order of Resplendent Banner from the Republic of China. Prior to his time in Japan, he was Director of Asia Pacific Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense from 1998 to 2000. Lieutenant General Gregson is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the US Naval Institute, and the Marine Corps Association, among several others. Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Gregson, for accepting our invitation to deliver the special address on a short notice. I'm also delighted to introduce the chair and moderator for today, Cleo Paskal. She is an associate fellow in the Energy, Environment, and Resources Program and the Asia Pacific Program. She is research lead on Chatham House project on perceptions of strategic shift in the Indo-Pacific from the points of view of the US, the United Kingdom, India, Japan, Oceania, and France. She has lectured at a wide range of organizations, including the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Royal College of Defense Studies, UK, US Department of State, US Army War College, US Air Force, Inter-American Defense Board, Washington, DC, National Defense College, India, as well as for the heads of major corporations and groups of security professionals from over 30 countries. She is widely published in both academic publications and the popular press and is a regular media commentator. She has contributed to, among many others, The World Today, The Diplomat, Defense News, Washington Examiner, the BBC, and is the North America Special Correspondent for the Sunday Guardian newspaper. Thank you very much, Cleo, for graciously accepting our invitation to chair and moderate this discussion. With these words, I would like to hand over the floor to Commodore Vijesh Gar, distinguished member C3S, for his opening remarks. Over to you, Commodore.
Thank you, Bala. Thank you so much. And welcome to all our esteemed guests in the audience this evening for a very interesting topic which concerns to all of us. Now, if we just look back, a week back when Communist Party of China celebrated the 100-year celebration and the speech of Xi Jinping, there's no mention of COVID-19, its effect on the whole world, the humanity. It was missing from this speech. And this is what I call the value and the traits of this China, the Chinese, and the CCP. Yes, the China is ambitious. They are the expressionist. They are repressive. They are hyper-nationalist. And of course, they are totalitarian state. Under Xi Jinping, in last 1 decade, we have seen that. But has changed the constitution of Communist Party itself. Now, but he realized certain things. Recent military incidents, including Indian borders, they realized very clearly that conventional war be anywhere going to be very effective, very costing for them as well. Be men or the machine, the damage is going to be colossal. So what is the next answer? Because they don't want to change their attitude of being expansionist. So what they do to achieve their strategic, political, economic or military objectives, they are resorting what we call the gray zone warfare. In the zone, just avoid the conventional warfare and do everything else. But Bala defined the political warfare. It's a part of that. Now, what is that? Because in gray zone warfare, there is nothing legal, there is nothing illegal, there is nothing ethical, nothing unethical. You just do it. It is virtually unrestricted warfare as the domain is concerned, the areas are concerned, and the canvas is too big. Now, what do you do? You use information warfare, you use the psychological warfare, cyber warfare, media, you use honey trapping, you create protests in a country. Dr. Bamde will agree with me. You use coercion, you use including the biological warfare, which they have done. They will not accept it, but they have done it. Wuhan is in China, nowhere else. Wuhan virus comes from there. But they want, that CCP wants other nations, especially the democracies, to listen to them and go their way. Because in democracies, there are fault lines, there are parties, their citizens have expression to express their freedom, unlike the China. So they want to influence. So they want to do influence operations in which they want to create factions in the society, factions in the political parties, factions in the media, factions in social media, and then bribe them, exploit them, and make them pro-China to convey their narratives. This is what I understand the political warfare. Either you listen to me as a nation, or I will do subversion, I'll create problem for you, I'll create disturbance. This is what happened in Nepal, it happened sometime back in Thailand. They are doing the same narrative in Taiwan. That is what they're playing around with. So this is Chinese are known for, and they're not here. Bala mentioned that even they're trying the same influential operation in UN bodies. In WHO, we saw during pandemic. We are watching the WTO now. So they're playing their dirty games as they play in the name of the gray zone warfare. Of course, the better definition will come, which Professor Kerry has mentioned in his book of the political warfare. How they do it, where all they do it, and how we can prepare ourselves to guard against it, prepare ourselves, our strategy to counter it. That's what the discussion today. So I will stop it here and leave the whole discussion to Professor Kerry to take it forward. But before that, I request General Gregson to give a special address to the whole audience here. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and I'm pleased to be here to speak to such a distinguished audience. I recently had the honor of placing the foreword in Professor Gershaneck's book, Political Warfare. This important book speaks to an American audience and perhaps others who have forgotten in our post-Cold War victory euphoria that political warfare is a powerful way to assault the values and principles of democratic forms of government, trade, and commerce. It is China's way to build forms of control over other states. I know Kerry will provide a detailed explanation of political warfare and its causes and cures. I'll leave those details to him, and I'll confine my remarks to providing a description of the context, the environment that surrounds and helps to empower political warfare. Given my background, you won't be surprised that I concentrate on defense. It is my firm conviction that a strong conventional deterrent, defined as an undoubted capability to prevail, is essential to counter coercion applied by the People's Liberation Army. China's coercion and intimidation are far less compelling without the psychological and physical pressure produced by the size, power, progress, capabilities, and activities of the PLA and its associated paramilitary arms. This pressure grows as China becomes ever wealthier. China's hard power forces include an estimated 2.3 million Chinese under arms. It is rapidly modernizing, expanding, and professionalizing thanks to seemingly limitless state resources. It has access to the most advanced technologies with growing power to intimidate and coerce. Thanks to the work done by our previous administration, China is now the declared main driver of our defense policies, strategies, and capability development. This is not our first such shift. We Americans have long been fascinated with our changing visions of China. We also have long been fascinated, despite evidence to the contrary, of our ability to influence China. Our traders, businessmen, and missionaries have been drawn to China from our earliest days. The Empress of China, a three-masted, square-rigged sailing ship of 360 tons, built in 1783 as a privateer, sailed for China from New York Harbor in 1784 to open trade. Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth, published in 1931 as one of her eventual 41 books, provided a warm and flattering view of the Chinese people under the last emperor. Nationalist China fought against Japanese invaders in what was called the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937. They became a de facto ally of the U.S. from our entry into the war in 1941. Mei Ling Sung, better known as Madame Chiang Kai-shek, generated strong U.S. support for nationalist China. She has been called one of the most influential women of the 20th century. The fall of our World War II ally, the Mao's communists, in 1949, was a shock that reverberated through our own government for years as we looked to assign blame, as if it was ours to lose. With Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping's charisma and his market reforms gave us optimism. We believed that as China became more successful, it would become more liberal. We also believed that the end of the Cold War established liberal democracy as the inevitable world's governing system. With all that settled, democracy ascendant, there was nobody left to fight. So we set about harvesting a so-called peace dividend and assisted China's re-entry into the existing international order. We even championed their entry into the World Trade Organization. This happy circumstance of liberalization did not quite work out the way that it was intended. Now, Xi Jinping is the core leader, moving sharply away from collective leadership. As part of his great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, we see extensive territorial claims to the entire South China Sea. China militarized, despite promises to the contrary, 7 artificial features in the Spratly Islands made from coral and rock dredged from the sea. These are as big as Washington inside the Beltway and as big as Pearl Harbor. Minorities in Xinjiang province and Tibet are under increasing pressure, described as cultural genocide. We see increasing pressure on the territorial waters and airspace of Japan and Taiwan, theft of intellectual property and technology, the trashing of treaty obligation on Hong Kong's autonomy, and a massive expansion of China's military and paramilitary forces and their use in coercion and intimidation, supporting massive political warfare campaigns. India has not been spared. China's coercion and intimidation came to Ladakh's Galwan Valley in 2020. These and other actions serve to convince us that our vital interests and those of our allies and friends are at risk. Changes must be made. When America rushed forces back to Asia in 1950, the PRC had no ability to project force beyond the mainland. With China's burgeoning economic success, the PLA has grown apace in both quality and quantity. China projects forces at will in the region and beyond. Taiwan is the priority target. The unmistakable message, often stated in Chinese professional journals, is that Taiwan's situation is hopeless. By extension, the countries in the first island chain have no hope. That simplistic interpretation often finds support elsewhere. Countering that narrative and reducing its effectiveness requires Taiwan, with U.S. collaboration under its obligation and its national interest, to maintain an undoubted ability to prevail against armed attempts at subjugation. Action follows this conclusion. A more structured approach looks likely from the new U.S. administration. One small sign with a loud voice is a formal invitation to Xiao B. Kim, Taiwan's representative to the United States, to attend President Biden's inauguration. Another is the State Department warning about Chinese overflights of Taiwan and simulated attacks on an aircraft carrier. The confirmation hearings for the Secretaries of State and Defense brought forth strong statements indicating that the soft on China era is over. Secretary Blinken's hearing also brought forth a welcome affirmation of our deep and abiding commitment to universal human rights. Many important officials do not require Senate confirmation. The National Security Council staff is shifting the center of gravity of its staffers from the Middle East to Asia and the Pacific. Kurt Campbell is the Asia coordinator under National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. We may assume that we know their policy direction. They made it public in an article titled "Competition Without Catastrophe," published in the September-October edition of Foreign Affairs last year. The last administration's national security strategy and national defense strategy announced our new vision. Government documents rarely become bestsellers, but defense committees in Congress acted. Thanks to our friends at the American Enterprise Institute, we know that fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act included no less than 43 Asia-related provisions in its 4,517 pages. The Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance of March 2021 announced strong support for tougher policies. The soft on China era is not returning. One of the most significant provisions of the Defense Authorization Act is the creation of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or PDI. This long-sought initiative mirrors the European Deterrence Initiative that began life as a European Reassurance Initiative in 2014. This Pacific version comes with $2.2 billion in funding and establishes clear visibility for Congress to account for funds against programs and priorities. Its published fact sheet states that its intent is to, quote, identify the specific resources required to enhance U.S. deterrence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. The key words here are enhance U.S. deterrence. As I mentioned before, credible deterrence requires an undoubted capability to prevail. The Pacific Deterrence Initiative and conventional deterrence are not the end of strategy and policy, but they are a necessary and critical component. Pardon me. With a restored conventional military deterrence capability, we can much better counter China's political warfare. A long journey lies ahead for the United States and our many allies, partners, and friends, but early trends are promising. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General, for the special address. May I now request the chair and moderator for today, Cleo Paskal, Associate Fellow, Energy, Environment and Resources Program, Chatham House, to introduce the topic. Over to you, Cleo.
It is an enormous pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Bala and Commodore and General Gregson, for setting this up. India has been at the forefront of receiving some of the most aggressive Chinese political warfare of any country on the planet. So watching what happened to India just over the last year brings to the fore what it can do. There was the attack on the iPhone parts manufacturing plant in Bengaluru, designed to create the impression that India is not a good destination for redirection of supply chains. There was the Maoist attack on the security forces. There was the attack on the Mumbai electrical grid. There was perhaps involvement in the protests in Delhi, and if not directly in the protests, at least in the social media around the protests. There was whatever happened with the second wave, including the oxygen concentrators that were not being allowed to be exported, even though they were bought by somebody else for delivery to India. So across the board, India knows what political warfare is and has been suffering from it very visibly for the last year. Especially since they found out in Galwan that Indians can fight. And so conventional kinetic warfare may not be as attractive an option. And what we've also seen from the outside is that India knows how to fight political warfare. There was as a reaction to Galwan, there was the banning of the apps, which was a stroke of genius. There's a use of very clear language. In his introduction, Bala called it the CCP virus, which is exactly what it is. And Commodore Garg, I wish you could repeat what you said in your introduction on CNN. I think it would be very helpful for a lot in the US to understand what's going on domestically in the US. So, not only has India been on the receiving end of this, but it's been leading on the fight back. And that's why I'm so delighted about this event, because at the same time, there have been those, particularly General Gregson and Professor Gershaneck, who have been fighting this same fight. And so it's like you're knitting you're laying railway lines in two different directions, and this is the last spike where you get to kind of come together. And the spike of this is Professor Gershaneck's book, Political Warfare, which is what we're going to discuss today. And I'm delighted that you've given us the opportunity. C3S is doing great work, and this is an elemental part of it, political warfare. So we're going to learn more about that book now from the author, Professor Gershaneck, and I will hand over to you now, sir. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ms. Paskal and Bala, for your excellent introductions, and thank you, Commodore Rajesh and General Gregson as well, for establishing such a solid foundation for the book discussion today. The topic is going to be give and take here. I'm going to talk to you about my book, but I have learned a lot from my Indian friends. Go back 21 years ago, just as a simple example, when I was at an organization in Hawaii called the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. There in a 3-month course with some of your best brigadiers, some of your brightest diplomats, some of the really, really just mesmerizing and really compelling individuals you sent to that course. We became very good friends. So I invited them to my command, which was the same command General Gregson commanded, the headquarters for U.S. Marine Forces Pacific. I invited my friends, the brigadiers especially, to come up and speak to the Marine staff about their experiences. And to set that up, I talked to senior officers and MARFORPAC, Marine Forces Pacific, and said, they asked, of course, well, what will they talk to us about? Well, they said that they'd be happy to share with us their experiences in high altitude warfare. They said they'd be happy to share with us their experience with something called IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Most of the officers said, great, bingo, got it. A couple said, you know, see you in a polar world, we're never going to face that. So they came up and they gave us some excellent talks. And lo and behold, you know, fast forward to from the year 2000 when we were in school together at APCSS to September 11th, 2001, when 3,000 Americans and others died pretty hideous deaths in the World Trade Center, in the fields of Pennsylvania and in the Pentagon. And suddenly, American Marines are facing IEDs. We're fighting high altitude warfare. So those experiences, a lot of those officers who sat in those talks by your leaders, your officers, went on to be in very important positions in the wars that we fought subsequently. So again, these discussions are immensely valuable, and we both, I get a lot, immense amount from it, and I hope you get something from what I'm talking about today that you've lived all your lives, but I'll give an American perspective on it. Before I proceed, I just want to take a personal note here and say that our thoughts are with Commodore Vassan and his family today as they hold services for his younger brother. Please remember them in your prayers today and tonight. Now, before discussing my book on Chinese political warfare, please allow me to set the stage a little bit regarding the existential importance of this topic. The Commodore, General Gregson, and Cleo, everybody has already emphasized this, but I'll give my take on it. Specifically, we'll take a quick look at key aspects of China's political warfare and then look ahead. Let's look at what the Indo-Pacific region will look like, not may look like, will look like in the next few decades if China's highly successful political warfare is allowed to continue ineffectively challenged and unabated. Next slide, please, Paula.
I'm just sharing the...
I can't see what's on the screen.
It's coming up.
Okay. So that was the lead slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you. India, as you well know, is very familiar with the concept of political warfare. You've got extensive experience in it due to your unique history, due to your relationship with the USSR when it existed, and due to your close proximity to the People's Republic of China and their enduring political warfare against you. So you will understand this 1948 definition of political warfare by one of America's most influential diplomats, George Kennan. You also know that the Russian Bolsheviks greatly influenced early Chinese communist political warfare. You're well aware that the Chinese Communist Party has taken that foundation, though, and gone far beyond current Russian capabilities. In fact, it's fair to say that the totalitarian Chinese Communist Party has put its political warfare on steroids. Next slide, please. This slide is a very brief overview of China's political warfare, how it intends to achieve its geopolitical objectives, ideally without fighting, or at least without having to fight a large-scale kinetic war. As you think about the goals, the guiding framework, and the objectives of China's political warfare that you see on the screen, note that the CCP is engaged in what it calls unrestricted warfare against us. The Commodore went into great detail on that, and brilliant there. To reiterate what the Commodore said, anything is permissible, to include traditional active measures like assassination, kidnapping, and terrorism. China's book on unrestricted warfare, which is effectively doctrine there, despite a very concentrated propaganda campaign to make it seem like it had no influence in China. It has immense influence there. That book calls for 24 different types of warfare that are used individually or in combination against us. For example, let's take one term from the unrestricted warfare menu, and it's called biochemical warfare. So where do we see that? We see it daily. We see biochemical warfare in America. We see it largely, the chemical warfare, in the form of the fentanyl that killed more than 32,000 Americans in the year 2019 alone. And we see the biological warfare that's already been discussed, and that is COVID-19, that has killed more than 3 million people globally and has devastated economies worldwide. Now think about that. In what we consider to be peacetime, the Chinese Communist Party deems it appropriate to attack us through any means at all, regardless of lethality or legality. Also note the objectives. China's political warfare seeks to do a lot more than simply influence the target audiences to China's advantage. The CCP uses political warfare with great success to divide, to demoralize, and to, quote, disintegrate its enemies. You know the meaning of disintegrate. Disintegrate means destroy. The PRC views India and the United States as its enemies. The political warfare it is waging against us is an existential threat to both your country and to mine. Now, unfortunately, it's proven extremely difficult for many of our elected leaders and policymakers and democracies in general to understand China's political warfare objectives and that unrestricted warfare mentality. Now, whether that's through ignorance, naivety, willful blindness, or simple apathy, they've ignored these aspects of China's political warfare for far too long and at great expense to both your country and mine. Next slide, please. So what does the Indo-Pacific region look like if we allow China to continue its successful and largely unopposed political warfare in the next 2 decades? Asked another way, what price are we going to pay if we don't get much better at working together to detect, to deter, to counter, and defeat Beijing's political warfare against us? Next slide, please. The region will look like this. This is the view from Beijing, and it's Xi Jinping's China dream come true. But for India and America, it's our worst nightmare come true. By 2040, Xi Jinping will have achieved most of his fascist, expansionist China dream, well before the centenary of the People's Republic of China in 2049. The trade and economic implication of China's hegemony will be immense for India and the rest of the world, and the security implications, of course, will be quite severe. Next slide, please. This is a different view of the world that India will face. America has largely retreated from Asia. India, Japan, and Australia stand pretty much alone, isolated and subject to immense political, economic, and military pressure from both Beijing and its powerful mutual defense treaty ally, Russia. I use the term advisedly. I'll come back to that later. Communist China has annexed Taiwan. South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines have abrogated their treaties with the U.S. Most countries in the Indo-Pacific region are now either vassal states of China or, if lucky, merely neutralized, we used to call it Finlandized during the Cold War. China faces no major challenges politically or militarily in the Indo-Pacific region. Hence, the Chinese Communist Party is now free to much more aggressively pursue its goal of global hegemony. Next slide, Bala, please. Hopefully you can read these from where you're sitting. These are the milestones that get us to this bleak outcome. Now, this listing is based largely on a Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment study that was completed last year and also my personal experience. Again, by the year 2040, Xi Jinping has achieved most of his China dream. This achievement is a direct result of continued, and I'm quoting from the study here, continued feeble, divided, and ineffective response to China's increasingly aggressive political warfare in the region. Russia and China sign a mutual defense treaty. Under extreme duress, Taiwan gives up, allows itself to be annexed by the PRC. The first island chain is broken. America's alliances with Thailand, South Korea, and the Philippines are abrogated. The PLA gains access to a wide range of ports, airfields, and other capabilities across the region. The second island chain is broken. The U.S. chooses to fall back to what we call the third island chain, with military forces retrenched in Guam, Hawaii, and on the U.S. West Coast. China now is the unchallenged regional hegemon, and China's totalitarian model supplants democracy as the ideal governance model. Now, you might argue timelines, but the projected outcomes that I depict here are valid and they're clearly foreseeable. Next slide, please. So let's examine a bit more closely China's political warfare apparatus that it is using to achieve our China nightmare. This very simplified command and control slide highlights that China's political warfare is directed and closely supervised at the highest levels of the party state, the CCP Central Committee and the National People's Congress Standing Committee. Next slide, please. So these are the political warfare strategies that the China's party state is using to achieve Xi's dystopian vision. China's political warfare strategies are similar to Russia's, to include the use of similar information, geostrategic, economic, military and paramilitary, and legal and paralegal instruments. But note China's incorporation of concepts like the three warfares, digital colonization, and the online terror that constitutes much of its social media warfare. All are novel and are rapidly expanding. Next slide, please. The slide takes a deeper dive into one of the three warfares, media warfare. China, as you know, has invested billions of US dollars into building up flagship propaganda platforms and buying foreign journalists and media outlets. It uses many tools, from China-affiliated businesses to criminal gangs, to pressure editorial content in the media outlets as well. All of China's major media outlets run Twitter. Ironic, isn't it? Twitter is outlawed in China, but all of their propaganda outlets are using our social media platforms, as the Commodore noted earlier. They're using our social media against us. They use Facebook, they use Instagram. They create multiple accounts to tweet and send out social messaging in different languages, or they carry specific region-specific content. Online and cyber attacks against critics of the PRC are also important media warfare weapons. We see this in attacks on posted articles and broadcast programs, as well as against the media outlets posting them. Next slide, please. Like America, India faces China's United Front infiltration and subversion every day. You know, it's very insidious malign influence mandate. Purpose of the slide, though, is to help you think more broadly about the relationship between the United Front operations and another significant geostrategic influence program, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. Next slide, please. BRI is a powerful political warfare tool and very significantly alter the global strategic balance of power. Now, we've seen how other countries being a member of the BRI, that impacts those countries' political and security-related decisions to the detriment of the country that's in BRI and the country of, and other countries around it. Look at what has happened in the EU, for example. I can go into specifics later. But please look closely at this map. Look at the number of countries in red aligned with BRI. In the Indo-Pacific region, which is circled by the ring, look at the non-BRI countries that are currently surrounded by the countries in red. Yeah, you're basically surrounded. This map doesn't reflect agreements, incidentally, that China signed with subnational entities like cities and states. If I added in all those little dots in countries that aren't painted red, that this would be a pretty disturbing picture right here, but I just didn't have enough room to put all those subnational agreements on this slide. Nor does it reflect China's BRI inroads into what we call the large ocean states, such as the Pacific Islands. Right now, there are at least 8 Pacific Island nations signed on to BRI. Now consider the implications of China gaining control of their vast EEZs, their ports, their airfields, and their votes in international organizations through its BRI-based political warfare. Next slide, please. China's digital colonization as political warfare poses a very complex challenge. The purpose of this slide is to remind you of some of the key tools that China uses against us in this realm. You are very familiar with threats posed by China's use of data, surveillance, AI, and its so-called 50-cent army and its so-called netizens, the social media warfare and WeChat terror that we briefly discussed earlier. Notably, electronic communications infrastructure is a key element of BRI. Once China installs a nation's electronic communications infrastructure, the host nation and any other nation doing business in that country faces extreme danger. Next slide, please. This slide is a reminder that China's political warfare employs more than its own paramilitary and military forces General Gregson talked about earlier to persuade and to intimidate and to seize, to occupy, and to militarize strategically important locations such as those now islands in the South China Sea. As India well knows, China uses proxy armies such as the United Wa State Army in Myanmar. The UWSA occupies territory in Myanmar the size of the country of Belgium. It has significant influence over Myanmar's government. Look at the drone. Look at the UAV in the lower left-hand picture. China is providing UAVs to its proxies. India got hit already by a drone attack on a military facility. You can imagine the capabilities that the PRC is giving to its proxy armies regionally and globally eventually. Within India, as you well know, China once provided massive support for ethnic insurgents such as the Naga rebels and the United Liberation Front of Assam. From what I've read, China still maintains low-level contact with those groups. And as you know, last year, Beijing threatened to step up that support if India negotiates a trade agreement with Taiwan. Still, speaking of proxies, China uses criminal gangs and so-called security services in foreign countries. And it works closely with radical activists in what are effectively terrorist organizations in target countries. Next slide, please. As one example of China's support for radical activists in foreign countries, let's briefly examine one member of the Quad, Japan. The PRC directly and indirectly supports radical activist organizations in Japan that violently oppose Japan's ability to defend itself. Those radicals also work to subvert and ultimately destroy the Japan-America Security Alliance. The radicals claim to be well-intentioned, be peace-loving, pacifists, in fact. But that's a lie, you know that. Some radical groups are terrorist organizations. They initiate violent attacks on women, school children, and employees at military installations. They initiate mortar attacks on Japan's self-defense force and U.S. bases. They attempt to make our military aircraft crash through the use of lasers, balloons, and other means. And they booby trap and sabotage military facilities. They are, in effect, terrorist organizations. Worse, in a crisis, they're a fifth column for the PRC on Japanese soil. Next slide, please. With that brief overview of the scope of China's political warfare, let's turn now to the book that's the subject of our book discussion today, Political Warfare, Strategies for Combating China's Plan to Win Without Fighting. A question I get consistently asked is, why did I write this book? Okay, simple answer. I wrote the book to fill a fatal gap in the knowledge of the U.S. government, our news media, our business, our education system, and our civil society. As General Gregson said, over the past 3 decades, America has lost its ability to detect, to deter, to counter, and defeat hostile political warfare. In the case of China, frankly, it often appears we intentionally threw away our defenses. So while trying to write a readable book, not one that'll just sit on the shelf and collect dust. I set out to describe the existential threat that is posed by China's political warfare, to describe the complex and highly deceptive warfare in sufficient detail that Americans can begin to effectively fight back. So as you see by this table of contents, I devote 3 chapters to describing the history and the current status of that threat. In addition, I devote 1 chapter to explaining the often confusing and ultimately counterproductive array of terms that we use to describe what China is doing to us. To make the threat even more comprehensible, over 4 chapters, I provide detailed case studies of countries that are close to the US but have been deeply impacted by China's political warfare. Finally, in 1 chapter and in the appendix, I offer the US government recommendations how to effectively fight back. Commodore Vassan asked me to devote much of my talk today to those recommendations. Next slide, please. The Kingdom of Thailand is one of the 2 case studies. Many Americans that I've received feedback from and people from other countries who've read the chapters on Thailand are quite surprised by the degree to which Thailand has seemingly willingly fallen under China's influence. Next slide, please. Taiwan, and as you know it, the Republic of China, is the other case study. Those who've read the 2 chapters have been surprised by the depth and the viciousness of China's political warfare against Taiwan. But they've also learned that even a small democracy can successfully fight back against totalitarian China. Can't do it alone, but it can successfully fight back. Next slide, please. So now let's get to the recommendations. Before I start, note that I fully recognize, as do you, that implementing these recommendations is going to require leadership, strong, visionary leadership, and a willingness to invest resources and political capital. America has to lead. More importantly, India has to lead. You have to make that investment. We have to make that investment. We must lead together. No one else will. So looking at these, looking at the recommendations, I'm not going to go into any of them in detail. I'll answer questions. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A if I can speed this up. But from American perspective, we need to learn to call what's happening to us political warfare. We need to be able to fight back, not in a stovepipe manner, which you do if you only think about it as, well, they're using malign influence against us. They're competing against us. They're doing public diplomacy against us. No, they're not. They're fighting a war against us. The last time we ignored a malign political force that said, I'm at war with you, was a guy named Osama bin Laden, who all through the late 1990s was saying, America, I'm at war with you. I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to kill your people. And the people who should have paid a little closer attention didn't. And so on September 11th, 2001, we paid a tremendous price for not believing it when he said, I'm at war with you. Same thing with China. They say they're at war with us. Their doctrine says they're at war with us. They say behind closed doors, it's a war. Everything is warfare. Note all the terminology I used. Unrestricted warfare, media warfare, strategic, psychological, operational warfare, lawfare, which is legal warfare. All of it is warfare in their minds. We need to be able to fight back properly by saying, okay, we're at war, let's think like we're at war and respond accordingly. We need to develop a national strategy. I would suspect there is one in India. I don't know. We ended our institutions that could have done a good job fighting PRC warfare when we did away with our U.S. Information Agency. We haven't rebuilt a replacement yet. We need to establish education programs. Recommendation number 5, and I'll come back to that number 4 later. Recommendation number 5, I'm aiming right at C3S here because someone has to start an Asian Political Warfare Center of Excellence, similar to the European Center of Excellence for countering hybrid threats and the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. We need something like that in the Asia Pacific region. I would strongly recommend that C3S take a look at being the home for that for the Indo-Pacific region. Next slide, please. We need to get better in America at training our people, giving our agencies and departments the right tools and the right legislation they need to investigate, disrupt, and prosecute illegal foreign influence activities. Right now, we don't have quite enough to do the job. Again, that's number 6, give them the capabilities. Number 7 is give them the readiness, training, and manpower they need to do the job. And do what we're beginning to do a little better in the U.S., especially with this administration and the previous administration, but not so much before, is that expose those operations much better through the government, through think tanks, through media reports. Raise the costs. We can talk about how you do that. That's specifically part of an education program that I'll discuss in detail in a few minutes. And then we need, under American law, we have laws that we can persona non grata, we can charge consular officers of the PRC, their embassy officials who are going out and interfering on our college campuses through their Chinese students associations and through Chinese American organizations in Hawaii and in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago. These consular officials, these embassy officials, are violating the civil rights of American citizens. We need to get better at using what laws we have to prosecute them and then PNG them, persona non grata them out of our country, and again, raise the cost of them interfering with our people on our soil. Next slide, please. Again, these are self-explanatory to an extent. The accountability in academia, what's happened in America has been a disgrace. We have Harvard University over a very short period of years, 6 or 7, taking $55 million from China. We have Stanford University taking somewhere around $33 to $35 million from China. I think we're naive if we think that these contributions, that's just one of many institutions, those are just a few of many institutions who finally, under rulings made under the previous administration, the Trump administration, finally had to fess up how much money they were taking from the People's Republic of China. And if you don't think that that money influences decisions made at those prestigious universities, you're pretty naive. We need to take a look at allowing the Chinese student associations that are basically run by the consular offices, in the case of Hawaii, out of the consular office in Los Angeles. In other countries I've lived in, those student associations are run out of the embassy. I'm told that firsthand by students who belong to them, that they are getting their direction from the embassy officials. So just get rid of those associations and start new ones that are not affiliated with the PRC. Academic study, I'm sure India has a lot of studies going on right now. You encourage theses to be written about political warfare. When I first went to Taiwan and did a study through the National Central Library, which holds every thesis in Taiwan that is submitted by graduating doctoral or master's levels student, I found a total of less than 20 that dealt with the subject of political warfare, and most of those didn't actually address PRC political warfare. So again, in Taiwan, which is on the front line of PRC's political warfare against the world, we had nowhere near enough focus in academia on confronting this existential problem. And then in America, we need to get better at making everything that the PRC does to our news media reciprocate with theirs. They throw out 5 of our journalists. We ought to throw out 30 of theirs, because proportionally they have far more journalists, so-called journalists, that work for their state propaganda organizations in our country than we have in China. So we need to come up with legislation that diminishes the offensive power of their news media and their social media. Next slide, please. Education programs, again, you can read this in the book. I'm not going to go into great detail, but we used to have them in the United States during the Cold War. Again, we threw it out post 1991 when we said it's a unipolar world now. It's the end of history. We have no need for these education programs. No one's going to ever, no totalitarian regime is ever going to be in a position to threaten us again. Incredibly naive, but we have to start from scratch all over again. And we're beginning to do that. Next slide, please. The Asia Political Warfare Center of Excellence, again, I recommend that you take a close look at becoming that. The template is there. I'm not going to go into what's on the screen right now, but you can adapt this to the culture, to the political environment in India. You can adapt this pretty easily, what has been set up in Europe, because basically what you see on the slide there, I just adapted it from the European models and tailored it towards Asia, the Indo-Pacific region. So again, a lot of the template for what needs to be done is already laid out for the political warfare COE. Next slide, please. A major initiative that could be done quickly. The COE would take a little while to get the funding, select the right people, to get the facilities. Okay, that takes time, but you could set up C3S could set up a 5-day counter political warfare course under agile leadership in about a month. You could begin educating those in India who need to be educated, and those regionally who need to begin the education process about PRC political warfare. You could do that rather quickly. That's laid out in the appendix of my book as a template for how to begin that. And again, I won't go into what's on the slide. Suffice to say that you've got a curriculum, you've got a philosophical underpinning for that course, and you've got some guidance, some pretty detailed guidance on how you might make that work. Next slide, please. One of the most important things that your course would do and the COE would do is you gotta take the fight back to the PRC. If we just, to use a Marine term analogy, or Indian Army terminology, if we just dig a foxhole and hide behind the parapet and wait, with a fixed bayonet for the PLA to attack, we're going to ultimately lose because we're always playing defense. This course, especially the COE, because that's higher level education, that's where you get the great minds together to figure out how we effectively raise the costs to the Chinese Communist Party for its political warfare. We did that with the active measures special working group that President Reagan set up during the Cold War. We did it very successfully. We can do it again. But again, we need to begin taking the war back. If we just play defense in any sport, you just play defense, 99 out of 100 times you're going to lose. Next slide, please. Again, just some different thought processes laid out in there about things that we don't teach, topics we don't teach anywhere in the U.S. anymore, whether that's at Georgetown, our feeder school for our diplomats, whether it's at our National Defense University, our Army War College. We don't teach these skills, these thought processes anymore about how you develop the plan, an executable plan, to go back and take the fight back to Beijing regarding political warfare. The book gives you some guidance on how to begin building those thought processes. In this case, it's how do you begin to approach strategic communications with that foundation. Then, if you have a solid foundation in strategic communications, then you can begin building the rest of the framework that would be directed under your national strategy regarding winning, defending your own country, and then taking it back to cause the PRC to back off. Next slide, please. With that, I have pretty much tried to keep under my allotted time and spent some time on my recommendations. At this point, I will be happy to return the microphone to the chair, Ms. Paskal, and open up for Q&A, and I'll go mute at this point, Ms. Paskal.
Thank you very much, Professor Gershaneck. That was extremely useful overview, not just of the topic, but what we can do about it. And as I think, as you said, India is particularly well placed to lead the charge on this one, not having even fallen for the BRI trap. It's very well aware of what's going on in the region. There are, as one would expect from the incredible C3S audience and participants, a list of very good questions. As chair, I'm going to take my prerogative and hand it back to Commodore Garg for his question. Would you like to ask it personally, sir?
Commodore sir, you're muted, sir.
Professor Kerry, my question was, in China is using the political warfare outside, but what tools and tactics they are using for the own people to maintain this totalitarian regime which they are maintaining now?
Thank you, Commodore. That's was largely by necessity overlooked in my presentation. The People's Republic of China is, as you know, an expansionist, militarily and economically powerful, brutally repressive, fascist, genocidal, totalitarian regime. That isn't just for export. They've killed more people than were killed during World War I and World War II. Their own people, in good weather, 70 up to 70 million people. You can debate the numbers. There's debate in academia, the numbers, but it's somewhere between, say, 50 million and 70 million Chinese people have died at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. Much of it, the Great Leap Forward, much of it in the Cultural Revolution, all these misjudgments, all these horrible policies that caused people to starve. But it wasn't just starving. A lot of it was just mass murder. The Tiananmen Square massacre seems important to us, and it should be. It should be forever burned into our brains. But the reality was that was a very small number of people that were massacred in Tiananmen and all around China during that time, and subsequently, compared to the millions that died during, say, the Cultural Revolution and during the other campaigns that were waged. If you, Commodore, were in Beijing today and you tweeted that Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh, okay, the secret police would be kicking in your door in your hotel probably within 45 seconds. This is the same secret police that can't find the massive organized crime cartels in China that are providing the precursors for all the fentanyl that's killing all the thousands and thousands of Americans and people worldwide. But they would find you because they have an incredibly repressive surveillance state that they're exporting, incidentally, through their BRI and through their surveillance and their Huawei and the other organizations globally. They're exporting their surveillance state, but they've pretty much perfected this totalitarian repression within their own borders. So it's massive, and the thought control, the hyper-nationalization, the social credit system, all of these factors that are very consciously being implemented by Xi Jinping and the Politburo are all designed to get mindless, robot-like compliance internally, be able to say, oh, our people are requiring us to go attack Taiwan. Our people are requiring us to go take back that land that India stole from us. Our people are requiring us to reclaim the South China Sea. Nonsense. They're generating the hysteria and then using it as pretense. So it's part repression, and a large part manipulation and psychological conditioning of their own people. I hope that answers your question, Commodore. Thank you for it.
Cleo, sorry for the intervention. Can I help you by taking all the questions in the chat box as a standard SOP? Is that fine?
Sure. And I note that General Gregson also has a comment to reply to this particular question. And then do you want me to hand it over to you? Is that what you like?
Yeah.
Okay. General Gregson, I note you put an answer in the chat box. When this is broadcast, people won't be able to see what's in the chat box. So perhaps you'd like to answer it verbally?
Certainly. I just wanted to add a footnote to Kerry's last answer that China devotes far more personnel and monetary resources to internal security than they do to the PLA, as big and bad as the PLA is. To me, that's a big indicator of their zeal to repress their own population. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bala, before you continue, just to make it clear to everybody here, the book is free. So if you want to read the book, you can download it for free from the U.S. Marine Corps University Press. And are you going to have it on your site as well, or?
Yes, we have already shared it with our distinguished members of C3S. Upon request, we'll be able to share the book with the.
Perfect. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Cleo. The first question is by Dr. L.V. Krishnan, nuclear scientist. He has asked, how willing are transnational corporations in joining the fight against China's political warfare?
The answer to that's going to depend on how reliant that multinational or transnational corporation is on business in China. We've, to our great disenchantment in America, we've seen our own brands, some of our most important brands, buckle under pressure from the PRC. Now, I can point to Marriott Hotels. I can point to the National Basketball Association. We can point to a lot of organizations that basically are willing to do and say whatever the PRC wants them to. Hollywood, in writ large, is a great example of that. I can give you many examples of the films that have been put out in Hollywood since the PRC effectively took control of the productions coming out of there. Nobody will produce a movie like 7 Years in Tibet anymore. No one will ever produce a movie for now until we pass legislation and begin implementing a process by which we liberate Hollywood, California from foreign control. You're not going to see this very important way of educating the world, not just the American public, that is Hollywood productions, TV shows and movies, informing them, developing their thought processes. You're not going to see anything that's negative about the PRC right now. So the sort of roundabout answer to the question is it depends on how much pressure our governments put on those multinationals. There are good people there, rest assured, but the reality is money talks. And when we have Americans on charge of, again, what used to be very patriotic, very pro-American corporations who say, no, my shareholders aren't, we're not American. My shareholders are multinational. I owe it to them to make a buck for them. So I don't really care about your national security issues. We're not going to help you to fight back against China because we would lose business. We would lose profits. The old, you're quite familiar with the old Bolshevik saying that the capitalists will sell the rope that we will use to hang them. Well, that's, adapt it to the totalitarian Chinese Communist Party today, and that's exactly what's happening in many cases. So I would answer this question by saying it all depends on primarily how much pressure our governments will put on these businesses. If we leave it up to goodwill alone, I'm afraid against the onslaught of PRC propaganda, coercion, blackmail, bribery, deception, a lot of the business community leaders are completely unequipped, ill-prepared in every way to deal with that. They may be able to make the grand bargain amongst other businessmen. They're way out of their league when they're dealing with the United Front. They're way out of their league when they're dealing with the best political warfare operatives in the PRC. So with pressure and support and education, it's not just pressure. It's a wide front that we're getting civil society, business, the education community on track for this fight with resources and pressure. I'd say we stand a much better chance of getting those multinationals on the right side of history here.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is by Ms. Harini. She has asked, how do you, in terms of the Chinese BRI project, how do you view the Chinese attempts to internationalize renminbi through the prism of political warfare perspective?
I got the first part of the question, but how do I view
how do you view the Chinese attempts to internationalize renminbi through BRI projects in a political warfare perspective?
They've got a hard sell to do it. I'm not an economist, so I won't dwell too much on this because I'm not. There's some things I'm qualified to speak on. When it comes to economics, I'm not qualified to speak on it, so I'm not going to dwell too much. What I will say is that RMB issue is key, though, to their ability to wage political warfare. So what we need to do is make sure they cannot change their RMB, their system that they have. RMB internal, in theory, externally use foreign currency, right? If we can find ways, this is going for their jugular, find ways to cut off their ability to transfer, to get that foreign capital, to wage their political warfare operation, to wage their political warfare through BRI, if we demit that, if we call out their personal, their family investments in foreign cash in foreign countries, and expose that, and again, up the cost, make them pay a price. And then it comes back to a different approach, I think, than what your questioner wanted here. But it's RMB as a means of waging political warfare, but RMB as a means of us waging it back against them. Find ways to block them from exchanging that RMB into US dollars. Find ways to make them pay a price every time their family wants to secretly out, expose it, create divisions inside their countries like they're creating in India, in the United States. And I think we'll see powerful response that may be one of the avenues we need to get them to back off.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is by Colonel Hariharan. He has asked, how can democracies with multi-party system, often with conflicting goals, context elections every 5 years or so, can develop long-term strategies to fight the CCP's political warfare? Free press, social media, basic freedom of the constitution often becomes self-defeating for such strategies. How do we manage this? Can't we develop counter strategies targeting the PRC?
That's why I wrote the book, is because it's hard for democracies to fight. There's so many seams in the military sense of the term. There's so many seams that the authoritarian, in the case of the PRC, the totalitarian hegemon, can come in and divide and disintegrate us, demoralize us, get us to go at each other's throats. It begins, in my mind, and I've been asked General Gregson if he feels comfortable coming in and joining this discussion. He's been my mentor. The basic foundation starts with education. So many American senior officials I talked to didn't understand political warfare. Read my preface. I won't make you all go into deep depression and have to have a stiff drink after this when I'm done by reciting what I put in the preface. But the preface details some of the conversations, some of the absolutely disgraceful acknowledgments of ignorance or willful disregard of the facts at very senior levels in the U.S. government. I will attribute at least part of that to ignorance. Georgetown and all the other feeder, the name universities Look for a course in political warfare. Look at Harvard, the School of Government. Look at the Kennedy School. You don't find it. You look at the Army War College. Again, the examples in my book of the impact of treating China soft. Oh, we've got to work with China on filling the global warming, whatever the issue is, your North Korea. Well, how well has that worked out for us? It hasn't. And yet that's always placebo. That's always the rationale for appeasement. Okay. So hopefully, that at least gives a rationale why we need to start educating people. That's why I address education so much. That's why I put such emphasis on a reputable organization starting that center of excellence, because it all starts with laying the foundation in our elected officials, our policymakers, our senior military officers, our lieutenants, we call them. Getting it down to there, getting it to our academia, which has been largely corrupted in America's case. I don't know about India, but I give you many examples that I've seen firsthand of American academic institutions that once had great renown that are basically reciting the PRC party line. We've got to begin fighting it somehow, and rather than go kinetic at this point, which none of us really wants but needs to be prepared to do, we need to begin fighting it on the information battlefield, and that starts with education. General, I'm sorry I talked too much. Please step in if you would like to.
Professor. My question is also slightly similar to Colonel Hariran sir's question. So if you allow me, China basically uses the kind of the freedom and the liberty that is guaranteed in a democracy to proliferate its political warfare. How do you plug in these loopholes? Because once you put a ban on something that is coming as a part of political warfare, the courts would step in and say that this is a violation of freedom of expression, etc. So how do you deal with that? There are certain deficiencies we do face as a system of democracy. So how do you deal with that, Professor?
During the Great World War II, America put a lot of restrictions on the American public because it was an existential fight. During the Cold War, we had more restrictions than we have now. I think if through public education, you're not going to get everyone on board, especially in America. You might get 60% if you do a really good job. That's okay. We don't work by consensus. You can't, or else you're committing national. I'm sorry, back up. We don't work by 100% consensus. You're committing national suicide if you try, because you'll always be in search of that consensus. In the meantime, you're being infiltrated, your throat is being slit by people who are in your door, in the form of the PRC, in whatever form of political warfare it will be, and part of that is violence, in fact. You're losing every day that you're just trying to persuade people. There are some necessary restraints on academia, for example. What could be done, and I'll use this example for Taiwan, where there's a number of pan-red, what we call them, pan-red academics. The party there system is color-coded, green, blue, green, DPP, blue, KMT, and then the pan-reds are overtly open. They want the PRC to take Taiwan. And they're in academia, and they're very high positions in some cases, in prestigious institutions. Okay, it's not a violation of human rights. It's not a violation of civil rights for the government of Taiwan to pass a law that says transparency. That's a beautiful word. Okay, sunlight, best disinfectant. You now have to report every trip you've ever made to the People's Republic of China. You now have to report. That's all it is. Report every national Taiwan dollar, every form of remuneration you receive from any entity within the People's Republic of China or other listed entities within Taiwan that are known United Front affiliated organizations. All right? That's simply transparency. You're not sending jackbooted Gestapo types in suppressing civil rights. You're simply required to expose it. And I think people in Taiwan would be absolutely astonished at what their academics are involved in. Now, apply that to India. a violation in India of human rights, of civil rights, to require something similar in the name of transparency? I don't know. Shaming. Again, what we did with South Africa some years ago, we just started shaming all the corporations that were affiliated with the apartheid in South Africa. It was a wonderful program. It worked tremendously well. So public shaming of organizations, that works. There's different ways you can do it without getting too draconian, but you have to pass some laws. You know, the media, if you have media organizations, I guarantee you do, because in America we do, that are under control of the PRC, then you have to have some reciprocity in the way you're treating their reporters, the way you're treating that organization. Again, under the previous administration, we named organizations that had operated freely here, that were getting subsidies from, say, the University of Hawaii. Propaganda organizations out of the People's Republic of China were getting subsidized stays in Hawaii by the University of Hawaii to collect and to recruit and do all the things that their people do. You need to stop that. And you need to stop that through legislation, and you need to stop that through other steps the government can take without infringing on civil rights. So wise people, which India has a lot of, you can sit together at your think tank and figure out the best approaches to that, but it can be done. And if you don't do it, where are you in 2040? You're exactly where I showed you on the map, and it's not a good position to be.
Thank you, Professor. The next question, I have a question, Professor. The US has the largest diplomatic presence. You have the best universities, many Chinese study centers in universities. You have a hold over the Mandarin language. Many Mandarin languages are there. But when I go through your book, despite all these, the command that you have, how did the US fail in deciphering the Chinese political warfare on this front?
Okay, I didn't get the very last phrase from your sentence. What the actual question?
Despite having, how did the US fail to know the real intentions of China and the political warfare aspects, despite having the best universities, the Chinese study centers, the academia, industry connect, with all put into place? When I go through your book, I did find that there were so many shortcomings. Even the syllabuses were not taught in the war colleges and etc. So where did the actual shortcoming come for the US?
Okay, I'll take a part of that, but again, I would invite General Gregson to come in on this, because he addressed this in his wonderful opening remarks. Over the years, we deluded ourselves. We bought into the dream that we could change the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party saw what happened to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They vowed they would not let that happen. Okay? They saw what happened when they crushed students with tanks on Tiananmen Square, and we really didn't hold them accountable for that. And they saw that they could get away with a lot. And then when the Berlin Wall fell, again, they studied a couple of things very closely. They studied how it was that we brought down the Soviet Union, okay? And they said, that's not going to happen to us. So that was a large impetus of their media warfare, of their political warfare in general, and aimed internally. We're not going to let an umbrella movement or one of those, the colored movements, colors movements, that's not going to happen in China. We're not going to let the U.S. stay ahead of us. We're going to study the Gulf War, 1991 Gulf War, in great detail and figure out what the Americans did right, and we're going to put that on steroids, and we're going to get our PLA far beyond that, and we're going to use paramilitary forces to augment them well beyond what America has. That's what they've been building towards, because they studied all that. So again, the people in charge never have any intention of losing power. the number one goal, we say it's global hegemony, but always the number one goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to retain power for the Chinese Communist Party. They're never going to lose power. And with that, I'll be quiet and I'll turn it over to General Gregson if he has something he'd like to add.
I agree with Kerry, and the only thing I could add is that we became very fascinated with the power of our own influence. Cold War ended. It was politically impossible to go to the American people after the collapse of the Soviet Union and say, well, we know we had high taxes and all these other things, and we won the great Cold War campaign, but there's this other campaign we have. So the choice was to try and reintegrate China or integrate China into the existing international system. We thought we could do this, and for 4 presidential administrations, we held to that myth that we had to, quote, maintain our relationship with China despite all of their insults to us and all their insults to sovereignty. We have finally woken up, and the course of this big ship is starting to change, and we're starting to recognize China for what it is. One of the things that perhaps should be re-emphasized in Kerry's excellent recommendations is we need to follow our own ideals. We need to believe in our own principles, and we need to be vocal about it, and we need to act in accordance with those principles, human rights included. And as we do, then we will find our way more to confront not only China, but other fellow travelers.
Thank you very much, Professor and General Gregson. The last question is by Dr. L.V. Krishnan. He has asked, if India and China have to work together, a possible first step is for the US to establish the Chinese language learning opportunities in India. There are very few persons in India with the familiarity of the Chinese language. Would you like to comment on this language aspect, knowing Mandarin as a means to, as a door to deciphering the real Chinese intentions? Professor, you are muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you so much. The Chinese language is important. When people bring this up, though, say, well, you can't really understand China if you don't speak the language. Dwight Eisenhower didn't speak German, but we beat Nazi Germany under his great leadership. He didn't speak much of it. He could have said Wiener Schnitzel, but he didn't speak it fluently. He didn't get all the nuances and all the historical references and the arcane discussions that my China scholars friends who are associates, I'll put it that way, who love to spend hours and hours. What did Xi Jinping really mean? Well, he meant, bottom line is, we're going to bash your skulls, foreign countries that try to stand up to us. That's what he said. That's what he meant. But they will they'll pole vault over molehills, is the term that we use informally, over arcane terms. The language issue can be important if you have the right people learning the language. So again, let me give you some insights on where we failed in America, in our intelligence community. There is a great book called The 100-Year Marathon, which is, I tout my book, of course, but there's others who I've learned from. And in The 100-Year Marathon, the brilliant fellow who wrote that tells about his awful experiences in the American intelligence community, where our linguists that we paid so much to get and put on the payroll, in many cases train, they chose to not translate the most egregious things that the Politburo was saying, that was being printed, that was guiding the thinking during the part where we were totally blind at American policymaking levels, because we had linguists, we had China scholars who who chose not to translate those offensive, what they thought would cause an overreaction by the American government, one way or the other. They chose not to even expose those writings. So again, that contributes to 3 decades worth of ignorance at the higher level of the American government, highest levels in many cases, because our own intel community chose to keep us blind, those linguists that we paid so much to have trained. So yeah, language is important, being able to have the folks who can read it, but for everyone who deals with the issue, to be able to speak it, that's pretentious, that's nonsense to say that you have to have that on a large scale. You have to have enough. And in a country of 1.4 billion people, I would think India, with the great education system you have and the highly, my friends who I stand in awe of from India, you've got enough that you can train. Does America need to set up a center? I don't know. I couldn't say it's something to adjust with the US Embassy in Delhi, but they might be able to help. But you've got to go to the right schools. And I would suggest Taiwan. Why? Because a lot of American education institutions, I don't recommend that people from overseas go there anymore, because they are accommodationist. They are in the appeasement mode. And if you go there, your people are going to come back having been indoctrinated with a very woke culture, as opposed, and woke's not a good term in America. They will be perhaps indoctrinated to become pro-PRC, which I've seen again at universities, and I point to the University of Hawaii. I've dealt firsthand with their staff, and they think the PRC is entirely fine. They refuse to assist the U.S. military many times. They could have with their expertise when I was working with them, because we're the bad guys in their view. So you be very careful where you send your people for language training, and I would suggest that is on the island of Taiwan.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Kerry, for patiently taking for all our questions. And my thanks also goes out to General Gregson for his insightful remarks. It was indeed insightful. May I now request Cleo Paskal to deliver her concluding remarks? Over to you, Cleo.
Thank you, Bala. I think if you want to know how to fight Chinese political warfare, you've just seen it for the last hour and a half almost. It's people of courage and principle and honesty talking about what the problem really is and working together to try to solve it. So it was a huge privilege to be a part of it. I think that U.S.-India relations have suffered at the hands of a lot of self-declared India experts in the U.S., and I hope that over the next phase, some of the subject matter experts like you've seen here can meet some of your subject matter experts a bit more, so that we can talk to each other about the things that really matter. As was said, both right at the beginning by Commodore Garg and just now by Professor Gershaneck, the U.S. is going through some tough times with some internal divisions and some problems in its educational institutions, and it may not be the beacon on the hill at the moment, and especially in the Indo-Pacific, I know that the beacon that I've been following has been the one in India, and so it's not as if you don't have enough to do already as a nation, but if you can help us with the political warfare fight against the CCP, would be greatly appreciated. And next time, I hope we can hear more from some of the incredible attendees who are here, who are incredibly knowledgeable on this topic as well. So I'd just like to, of course, thank Commodore Garg, who will speak after, General Gregson, Professor Gershaneck, Balasubramanian, the incredible team at C3S who keep it all going, and the attendees who, through their questions, display their incredible knowledge. Thank you very much for your time and your participation, and especially for your commitment to fighting this common battle alongside all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cleo.
Commodore Garg, over to you.
Thank you, Cleo. Commodore Vijay, sir, floor is all yours.
Well, we had a very nice session today about the political warfare. Professor Kerry mentioned one word, IED, being a military officer. So what I understood, the political warfare is actually IID. It is ideological, innovative device which is planted in the mind of the politicians, the society, the media, which they control, whether through bribing, whether through money, They do coercion and do what they want to do in that country. This is what I understood political warfare. Well, he very beautifully mentioned the recommendations, which comes out to be that we got to educate our people, our politicians, policy makers in every forum. And each activity which happened in the country, whether it's a protest or whether it's an activity, we got to have a system of intelligence, counterintelligence to identify, analyze, and when we find who is doing it, expose him nationally so that every political party, every faction understand how dangerous it is for national security. I think it goes for any country. Probably this was the region 12 years back, our forefathers, seniors established C3S in Chennai. That is the way we are studying here, we're learning the system. And we are putting these facts to the nation, what is happening around, what China is doing to us. So I think beautifully put across in this book. I'm very impressed, and I like to put on record to all the audience, which Cleo mentioned, the book is free. And this is what the initiative of telling people, learn. It is not at the cost. You got to learn for the national security across the world, what China is doing. The book is free, beautiful book, all must read it and pass it down the message to everyone you meet next to you. It is as good as COVID precautions, so is the China's political warfare precautions for everybody. What remains from you to thank General Chief Gregson for joining us, Professor Kerry for a beautiful presentation, and Dr. Cleo Paskal for really agreeing to be moderator and chairing the session. Thank you so much. Thank you.